Decade after decade, the Black community has been underrepresented in the census, and it seems to be happening again in 2020, with new reports saying African Americans may have been undercounted at a higher rate than usual, possibly 3 times as high as 2010. The jury is still out on the accuracy of the analysis, but if proven to be true, this count could have a major impact on funding provided to our communities, affecting benefits like Medicare, SNAP, Section 8, and also Head Start. Joining us now to discuss this is public policy leader and justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion advocate, Dr. Patrick Graham. He is no stranger to BNC Live. Dr. Graham, always a pleasure having you, sir. So just break it down.
Thank you for having me.
Always a pleasure.
Well, I'm going to tell you, one of the things that I'm really concerned about is not just the 3 times more for African Americans, because that's bad enough. But that same study shows that there's a possibility that count is 10 times more for our Black children. And so when you think about that, issues like childcare, money for education, housing, et cetera, are all impacted by that. And more important, by the year 2044, 2045, we know that we will have a majority, what they call minority country. And that generation is with us right now. So if we're not actually developing them, if we're shortchanging them, it will have an impact on our ability to be competitive as a nation.
Do you think this was intentional? Because it seems to happen often.
You know, I think that you've got to be more intentional about how you actually reach these communities. So I'll say that with the last presidency, I'll be honest, who knows? I'll be honest, I'm really not sure with that guy. But what I will say is this, that if we're not being intentional about making sure we count individuals correctly and make sure that we're getting into Black communities the way that we should to ensure that there's a count, then I would say it is intentional. Because if you're not being intentional about that, then you actually know what the consequences are going to be.
Dr. Graham, how much was the pandemic a factor?
I think that the pandemic weighed in a little bit. I think for one, a lot of Black communities do lack some of the technology as well as access to broadband in their homes. So when you have a census that went to a platform that was almost all virtual, that does raise some issues. It's the same thing in education and other areas that were impacted by the pandemic. So I would say that that technology gap has reared its head again, and that's something that we experienced before the pandemic.
Dr. Graham, according to the National Urban League, this could be the greatest undercount since the 1950s, 1960s. Do you agree?
I think absolutely, and it comes at a point when we've really been talking a lot about racial equity, so that's why that sting is there even more. When I think about the fact that we actually have invested so much time during the pandemic to really bring an eye and an ear to racial injustice, and then here we are again, it is something that's actually troubling.
So let's talk about how this undercounting can truly impact us. When you talk about the social programs that we depend on, we're talking about Medicare, we're talking about food stamps, we're talking about the Section 8 program as well, and Head Start.
Right. So it impacts us intergenerationally, right? So when you talk about Medicare, you talk about all those other things, obviously those who are elderly, those who are dependent on some of these programs, who, by the way, the majority of them have worked all their lives. And then, of course, those young people, like I said, you're talking about possibly 10 times more undercounted than previous years. That actually really sort of hits us at the heart. It's actually part of our asset when we talk about our young folks. And so if you look at all of those factors together, what you will actually see is a community that will still be trying to combat some what I call systemic racial issues or systemic racism in many ways. This helps contribute to it.
Can you, I love the point that you made about how it has a generational impact. Can you just tell us a little bit more about how it would impact those programs, especially Section 8? I mean, we're talking about people relying on that program for a roof over their head. And then Head Start, that's where you're sending your child to school to learn while you're working.
Well, you think about the percentages of cuts to those programs that they've already experienced under the previous administration. And then now you couple that with the fact that we have individuals living in communities who actually lack affordable housing. If we look at even things like Section 8 vouchers, some of the wait list on there are past decades of time. So that's actually really important to understand that we're already behind the ball in that, particularly in Black and Brown communities. And of course, Head Start, one of the things I will say, since 1972 all the way up to the mid 2000s, childcare has increased by 2,000%. So when you think about that, that shows you how much of an issue this really is.
Dr. Patrick Graham, always a pleasure, sir. Thank you for joining us.